In an automobile accident in 1975, my spirit left my body in the emergency room. I experienced the warmth and the presence of God and the peace while I saw my body racked in pain on the emergency room table. Yes, I believe in the afterlife. I know it exists. I've experienced it.
Where did we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? As Christians, we believe the answers to those questions are found in the Bible, and we accept those answers on faith alone. But what about those who are not willing to begin their journey by faith? Those that are looking for what they consider more substantial evidence. With that in mind, it's not surprising then the level to which modern science has raised the search for heaven. Could it be they're responding to the insatiable need to know more about what life's about and what lies beyond it? Current studies reveal that the vast majority of people the world over profess a belief in life after death and in a place called heaven. Many of us believe in heaven and have at least an idea of what it's like. But for all of us, there are some unanswered questions. This search for heaven will bring us face to face with research experts, Bible scholars and scientists who've been searching for the evidence that will provide critical answers, perhaps answers to some of your questions or questions others have asked you. Certainly, we believe that our destiny is heaven, but what are the biblical signposts that will guide us on the path of discovery? Are there spiritual proofs that can be tested objectively? If we find the borders of heaven, do we also discover the gates of hell? Your host for this special presentation is Jerry Rose, the president of a national cable and television broadcast group and the host of a daily television show. He's an ordained minister and has served for 3 terms as the president of the National Religious Broadcasters. And now, here's Jerry Rose.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. These first words of the Bible establish God as the eternal creator of all things, including heaven and earth. And from that beginning, right through to the book of Revelation, there are many references to heaven. Deuteronomy tells us heaven, even the highest heaven, belongs to God. And it was from heaven that God's voice was heard at the baptism of Jesus. Elijah went up in a whirlwind to heaven. And Isaiah implores us, lift your eyes and look to the heavens. Paul tells us he was caught up to heaven. And the book of Revelation promises there will be a new heaven and a new earth, and the dwelling of God will be with men. These and dozens of other scriptural references give us assurances that heaven is a real place.
The book of Hebrews, chapter 8 and 9, teach that heaven is more real than earth itself. And it is important that we understand the realness of heaven and set our eyes on a real place where we are really going to spend eternity.
Heaven is a spiritual realm, and its existence requires faith. We're told in the Bible that without faith we cannot please God, because we must come to him by faith. Could it be that finally, after 6,000 years, evidence is emerging that could prove that heaven exists? Mighty cathedrals with lofty spires and humble village chapels have all been built with the hope of heaven as part of the architect's plan. But from the most humble bricklayer to the most powerful king, this magnificent outpouring has its foundation in faith. Could it be that we're at the very beginning of a whole new era of knowledge and understanding? Is evidence now emerging compelling enough to convince the skeptics, even scientists? With recent advances in medical technique, more and more people are coming back from the edge of death. These medical miracles have given rise to a new phenomenon known as the near-death experience. People who apparently slip from the doctor's grasp but come back to life, so to speak, and bring with them remarkably vivid and unexplainable visions. Visions that appear to be associated with all of the beliefs we normally associate with heaven. Dr. Kenneth Ring, Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Connecticut, has worked with a number of these people.
In many near-death experiences, people talk about a feeling of tremendous peace and well-being, They often say that they find themselves out of their physical body and are able to see it as though a spectator to it from an elevated position. Many people describe traveling through a dark space, sometimes talked about like a tunnel, and then they find themselves in the presence of a beautiful radiating light of astonishing beauty, and where a feeling of love and great tenderness comes in. Some of these people also talk about having a life review in which they see virtually everything that's happened in their life, and then they may make a decision to go back to their body, or they may be told that they have to go back, that their work here isn't finished. Those are some of the typical features of a near-death experience.
But there are other aspects of the near-death experience that appear to go beyond the memory of the event and actually center on the immediate things going on around them. In many of these instances, the evidence is very compelling. Let's begin with a recent event that took place at the Hartford Hospital.
What do you got?
Cardiac arrest.
Epidemiology?
No.
Epinephrine. Okay. Pulse. Lab. Start CPR. Ready for clear. Lab resume CPR.
In spite of heroic efforts, eventually even the best physicians are forced to just give up. But in this particular instance, the patient apparently didn't. According to all medical and physical science, what happened in this particular emergency room was, well, impossible. What?
I thought it was an amazing thing. I left my body.
The woman told the doctor she had left her body entirely while those in the room had been working to revive her. She felt herself being pulled up through several floors of the hospital until she found herself on the roof. She was enjoying the view of the skyline when she noticed something red out of the corner of her eye. It was, she said, a shoe. Obviously, everyone was extremely skeptical. After all, hadn't she been completely comatose? But when Dr. Raymond Moody, author of Life After Life, heard about it, he was more inclined to accept the woman's story. Dr. Moody has researched hundreds of these kinds of events.
The near-death experience is a powerful statement of the reality of the afterlife. As resuscitation techniques improve, more and more people are having profoundly meaningful experiences when they return from the verge of death. They tell us that they find themselves out of their bodies and yet still functioning and alive. As a medical doctor, I began my clinical investigations of these experiences somewhat dubious, and then quickly realized that we can only ignore the evidence for so long.
Inevitably, one of those present insisted on proving the woman's story. It seemed simple enough, just have someone go to the roof and check.
Eventually, the reality of what's happening begins to set in, and you become aware that the only way of accounting for the decisive commonalities of these experiences is to assume their validity.
That's the shoe. That's the red shoe.
Under any circumstance, it seems highly unlikely that a woman brought in on the ground floor in a coma could have had any knowledge of a red shoe on a roof. But it takes more than anecdotal evidence, even this convincing, to achieve scientific credibility. What was needed was some scientific way to demonstrate that the body and the spirit can exist separately. That discovery would provide strong evidence for life after death. But how could that be done? Sometimes answers come from unlikely sources. In this case, the unlikely source was a woman named Pam Reynolds. A stunning array of scientific instruments and measurements were in place at the very moment of Pam Reynolds' death. The results were astonishing. At age 35, Pam was diagnosed with a life-threatening brain aneurysm. Her only hope was a very unusual operation. In order to fix the problem and to save her life, doctors would have to drain the blood out of Pam Reynolds' head. What's more, Her body temperature would be lowered to 60 degrees. Her heartbeat and breathing would stop completely, and her brain waves would be flattened. Doctors who perform this intense procedure have nicknamed it standstill, because for all intents and purposes, Pam Reynolds would be dead. But what happened was so thoroughly unique and unexpected, Dr. Michael Sabin, a cardiologist and the author of Light and Death, made an extensive evaluation of the Pam Reynolds experience.
The process of death, scientifically, now is known to be a process and not a point in time. It starts with normal waking reality and ends up in irreversible death. During this process, the body dies at different rates. The problem we have as scientists and physicians is to determine when the brain is actually dead, i.e. when the person is actually dead.
In the case of Pam Reynolds, one of the surgeon's main concerns was seizure activity, which could prove deadly during such a delicate procedure. To guard against this and other complications, Pam's brain and body were extensively instrumented and monitored, which makes what happened next even more intriguing. Pam told the doctor she left her body and became a spectator to what they were doing to her body. Later, she was able to describe people, procedures, and even medical instruments she could not possibly have seen.
Pam Reynolds had a very deep near-death experience at the time that she had documented no brainwave activity, no brainstem activity, and actually the blood had been physically drained from her head at the time. So this eliminates the possibility that this was a seizure phenomenon, because during her experience she had no seizure activity on the EEG. In addition, she had plugs in both of her ears, and so she could not have physically heard what was being discussed in the operating room during the surgical procedure, and she could recall the accurate discussions that were going on between the surgeons at the time that she was having her experience.
Remember, every bodily reflex was being monitored. She was in a profoundly inactive state. But Pam Reynolds somehow was able to describe a particular surgical tool in amazing detail. A tool which she would later say looked like an electric toothbrush with a dent in it. She even noticed that the tool had interchangeable blades and that these were kept in something that she said looked like a socket wrench case. How could Pam Reynolds have described with such amazing accuracy the details of what took place in the operating room when she was, according to all monitoring devices, dead? Dr. J.P. Moreland, professor of philosophy at Bible University, finds this kind of experience compelling.
The most provocative evidence for heaven from near-death experiences seems to me to be cases where people come back from near-death experiences and they have information there's no way they could have had if they had just had a physical experience while on an operating table. For example, some people come back and they're able to recount conversations that their relatives have had 5 blocks away from the hospital. In other occasions, people have actually had experiences of objects on the hospital roof or somewhere else, where when people go to investigate whether those experiences were real, they see the objects just as the people saw them. In other occasions, people have met dead relatives that